Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you here today. We are in our week 4 of the art lecture series for fall. I just want to remind us about a few things. One is we'll have Allison Cobb here today to lead us through whatever Allison wants to lead us through. So we will be working with Allison's presentation for about an hour, and then there'll be a half hour of Q&A. And I want to just really extend gratitude and admiration for how interactive you all were 2 weeks ago, and how that's so helpful for the person that's standing up here or even coming in on Zoom to know who they're talking to and have that be a discussion, have us interact. And before I move on, I want to just say that those of you who are on Zoom, you can type in your questions for us on the Q&A, and we'll read them to Allison and we'll intersperse them with the live questions. So make sure you do that if you want. Next 2 weeks we have Satpreet Kalan, who's an arts organizer and works in sculpture. And then the last speaker for the quarter will be Ellen Levy, who is a scholar and arts and aesthetics, and is coming to talk about a book that she's just publishing about Ray Johnson, a book about Ray. And she will be here in person, just like Allison is today, which is exciting. This is a move since the pandemic. I think maybe we've had one person come, or two maybe, in person, so this is a move towards pre-pandemic, and the importance of live interaction, and even though it's an effort to get here from far away, from Portland or from New York in the case of Ellen. So I'd like to now introduce Kaylin Andrus, who will be introducing Allison.
Allison Cobb works for the Environmental Defense Fund and is the author of 4 books that engage with personal ecologies and shared histories through poetry and prose. Her 4th book, Plastic, an Autobiography, resembles the molecular structure of polyethylene and reveals each of us as polymer units linked in a winding, interconnected chain. The book describes the co-evolution of nuclear weapons and plastic technologies, and simultaneously investigates the colonial history of Los Alamos, New Mexico, which happens to be Cobb's hometown and the location of the first nuclear blast. The book's title speaks to the material's pervasiveness. An autobiography of plastic is the biography of every living being. Cobb tenderly writes about the suffering of one of these beings, an albatross chick, affectionately named Shedbird, who died of starvation with a belly full of plastic. Recent samples taken from human cadavers confirm that we have plastic in our bellies too. Cobb's work meticulously threads together the personal and the political, allowing us to see our histories as interwoven and our futures as interdependent. Cobb's work has been featured in many journals, including Best American Poetry and Denver Quarterly. Without further delay, I am so happy to introduce Allison Cobb.
Thank you, Kaylin. That was wonderful. It feels so nice to be read and seen. Appreciate that. Hi, everyone. We're here in person, some of us. Hi, people on Zoom, too. Glad you're here. Thank you so much for having me. I always treasure getting to come to Evergreen and speak with all of you. I always learn so much when I'm here, so thank you for that in advance. And thank you to Miranda and Shaw and Kathleen for having me here. And thank you again, Kaylin, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And also thank you to JD and Mo, that's JD, who are making this happen. Am I hard to hear? Yeah. Oh, can you hear me in the back? Is this better? Okay. I sound very loud to myself up here. I'm like, there's another me right here talking back to me. So if you can't hear me at any point, just raise up your hand and I'll see you. Okay, hi. I thought today we could get started with a little meditation / visualization. Just to sort of settle in and be here together and think about this topic I want to talk about, which is love. So you can close your eyes if you like. If you feel comfortable, you don't have to. And let's start out by just feeling where we are. So sense yourself sitting, sense the chair, the ground below your feet. And maybe let's take a couple deep breaths. Just draw a breath deep into your body and release that. Let's do one more of those. Great. Welcome. Now, keeping your eyes closed if you like, please imagine someone or something that you love. It doesn't have to be romantic love, it can be any kind of love. Imagine this entity that you love, how your beloved looks, how they feel, how they smell, maybe even how they taste. Just bring your beloved into your imagination. Think about all their qualities that delight you and the love that you have. As you're feeling this, other emotions might come in also. Things like longing or grief, frustration, impatience, maybe even anger. Let those feelings come in too. Don't push them away, just let them be there. And see if you can return to the ground of your love, which is the base for all those feelings. And as you're imagining your love and you're breathing, see if you can locate where you're feeling love in your body. Maybe it feels like a warm glow, maybe a fullness in your chest. Maybe you're finding yourself smiling a little. Maybe you're not feeling it, that's okay too. See if you can just hang on to that imagination of your loved one and that feeling of love you have. And now, let's see if we can turn that love outward. See if you can take that feeling that you have and turn it to this building that we're in. If you're on video, to whatever building you're in now. See if you can turn your love to this place that shelters you, that brings you here into this event. Love for this technology of sound and video that's connecting us. For the solidity of where we sit and gather. And then think about turning that love to the people who made the building, the people who laid the foundation, made the walls, made the technology in the building for lighting and the warmth. Probably people from all over the planet with lungs and hearts and minds and hands contributed. to this structure that you're in. And maybe you can turn your love to those beings. And then maybe you can turn your love to the elements that make this building, to the metal in it that came from earth, the wood that came from trees, living trees, and to the ancient life forms that became oil that turned into the plastic here. See if you can just hold in your imagination all of that abundance and a feeling of love for it coming into material form for our sake. And then maybe as you're breathing, you can go back to where we started. If you can feel the surface that you're touching, maybe feet on the floor. And try sending your love downward to the earth, to the ground here that's holding up this building, to the soil and all the things in it. And even further to the bedrock, the solid rock that makes the earth solid. And even deeper than that, to the hot core of the earth. Can you send your love all the way there? The core of earth, which makes the planet dynamic and helps support the possibility of life here, our lives. Can you send love even down to the core of the planet? And we've traveled a lot with our love. Maybe it's possible to hold all that largeness. Maybe not. Maybe it's possible to just be here in our bodies. Just sensing whatever's happening is perfect. And then maybe let's just take a couple of breaths to return here. Drawing breath deep into your torso, you can let it go. Just let all that go. And breath in, just release that. And you can open your eyes if you want, if you had them closed, and come back here. Thank you for journeying with me this morning. I think you were, at least some of you were just in a writing lab, so maybe you have writing muscles warmed up. I thought maybe we could take a minute or two to just reflect on what that was like. Did you feel any experience, whatever you noticed? Maybe you didn't feel it. Maybe you had a completely different journey. Maybe just take a minute or so to just have some reflections, and then I'd love to ask you to share them. Maybe like another 30 seconds or so to finish your thoughts. I know it's not long. Okay, thank you. Does anyone have an experience or insight or contradiction or idea they would want to share out of that?
Sure.
Great.
In our writing experience, we worked with the sense of smell, and we needed to write about that. But I want to go back to your writing, because you bring us into this sense when I was reading about being able to put myself into the place and then around what you were explaining in your writing.
Did everybody hear that? Yeah, nods in the back. Okay, there was a microphone here, but... Oh, Shaw has it. Okay, that's okay. So your comment was that you had worked on the sense of smell, but this was about being fully physically in an environment. And so it was like imagining being there. So it was different, is what you were, a little different. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, that the being very bodily in a place is, I don't know, sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. Any other reflections? Yeah, you and then you in the behind.
I really liked the feeling of envisioning someone we loved and then feeling it towards the building. Mine kind of looked like ribbons sailing upwards and then glowing, I guess, through all the fires of the building. But yeah, I thought that was a really awesome feeling.
That is a beautiful image. So a person said that they liked, if you didn't hear, the loved one and then turning that outward to the building that looked like ribbons that then were glowing. You must be a visual person. That is beautiful. I love that. I can see it. And you, please.
Yeah, I noticed I've done like some meditation, like visualization stuff in the past, and the body feeling. Oh, thank you. I don't know. Okay, cool. Yeah, I noticed the body feeling for me of the sensation of love is similar to, or it's in the same places as the sensation of fear, but going in an opposite direction. And I had never noticed that before. So I appreciate you inviting us to do that.
That is super interesting. Wait, before you give it back, can you say what you mean by opposite direction?
Yeah, I think, so specifically I feel it in my upper chest and in my throat. And usually when I feel fear, there's a tightness there, but this sensation of love, there was an openness there.
I love that. Thank you so much for that insight. Yeah. That's beautiful. Yes, it's so close to all the other emotions, right? And that's kind of one thing that we're going to talk about today. So I want to talk about love, obviously. And this is kind of a new journey for me, thinking about love. And so I'm welcoming all your insights and wisdom and experience. I'm going to reflect a lot on the most recent work I've been doing about being a nuclear colonist and my past growing up in Los Alamos that Kaylin mentioned. But I've realized that this all really applies to all the work I've done and the work on plastic too. So I think you'll see those threads, I hope. I think I'll just say the thing that in our culture, the dominant, I think, belief about love is the love of pop songs, love between individuals based on often bodily sexual desire. And I think that can be seen as kind of an immature or naive, a very anxious kind of love, the way that it's rendered. I've been thinking about a different kind of love that is creative and communal and expansive and active. And I'm just sort of seeing the outlines and the shapes of it. So like I said, this is new for me too. Or maybe it's not new for you, it's new for me. I got to love because I wanted to start with Robert Oppenheimer's love for New Mexico. This is a picture of mesas near Los Alamos. Oppenheimer, who led the work to build the atomic bomb, famously chose Los Alamos because of his love for New Mexico. And I wanted to think about the ongoing damage of that love. This is a recent publicity photo from Los Alamos National Laboratory of their plutonium facility. So they're the only place in the Western Hemisphere now with the capability to build the plutonium cores for nuclear weapons. And actually, this is part of a quiet but very large expansion in the nation's nuclear weapons program. No one in the US built plutonium cores for weapons after the Cold War. Rocky Flats in Colorado, which built those cores, was shut down after environmental crimes and profound contamination. So the fact that Los Alamos now is the place with this capability brings a lot more toxic and radioactive materials to the area, including plutonium, which has a half-life of 24 million years. So it's pretty toxic. One of the pieces of ongoing damage from Oppenheimer's love. I realize, though, I have to ask about the sound. Can you all hear me okay? I feel like I'm echoing. Do you hear an echo? No. Okay, it's just me. Okay, we're good. I realized as I was thinking about Oppenheimer's love for Los Alamos that he wasn't the only one who loved New Mexico. The other scientists who came, many of them European scientists from mountainous countries, also would take breaks from the frenzied work to make the atomic bomb and go skiing and hiking and horseback riding. The shorter person in the center is Enrico Fermi, who won the Nobel Prize for being the person to first create a sustained nuclear chain reaction. And he died incidentally of pancreatic cancer in his 50s. But that love for the outdoors still really permeates the town of Los Alamos. People there have an outdoor ethic, love the mountains, feel very connected to the place. And they're not the only people with a strong claim on that area. The Hispanic settlers who came with the conquistadors about 400 years ago also have a fierce attachment and connection to the place. This is a Catholic church in a little town called El Rito, which is near Los Alamos. And the building looks fairly new, but there's been a church at that site for about 300 years. And then, of course, there's the indigenous Pueblo people who have been there from time immemorial and who consider that the Creator planted them in this place to be the caretakers for it. This is a ceremonial building called a kiva in San Ildefonso Pueblo, which borders Los Alamos. So I wanted to start with love, and I wanted to think about if there were a way to come together, nuclear colonists, settlers, and indigenous people around a love for place that could do something besides damage. This is a picture of the Rio Grande River coming down from Los Alamos into the valley. The lab has detected plutonium in the Rio Grande, so obviously it doesn't stay in Los Alamos, it travels. When I was thinking about love, I was inspired by a couple things. One is one of my mentors, Keta Gonzalez, who said at the heart of all work toward justice must be radical love, and then also by Bell Hooks, who's the Black feminist writer and scholar who wrote, "Without justice, there can be no love." I also was inspired by James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, which, if you haven't read it, it's a searing expose or thought piece about race in America, written in the early 1960s. And one of the things he was doing is sort of warning about what he saw as a coming race war in the country. And the word love appears in this book about 55 times. It's a short book, so it's about 100 pages. So love appears on just about every other page. And he really saw love as being central to resetting the course of the nation and avoiding what he saw as this coming conflict. So I kind of had all that in my mind as I was trying to work on this book about being a nuclear colonist. And I think you've read some of the opening sections of the book called Crave, which just sort of set up my emotional state in writing and my stake in the place. But what my plan was for the rest of the book was to interview nuclear colonists, settlers, and indigenous people, and just ask them to tell me about an aspect of the place that they love, kind of like what I did here this morning. It was about the place. So like a tree, a plant, a river, rock, mountain, mesa, what they love about it and why. And I thought just maybe doing that and having those conversations could illuminate something for me about coming together around love in a way that didn't just repeat damage. And I quickly learned in doing that that the question itself that I was asking was a colonial question, because the indigenous people in particular in that area don't think about the world in terms of discrete entities like that. I was speaking with a person named Marian Naranjo, who's an elder from Santa Clara Pueblo, which also borders on Los Alamos. And when I told her what my project was and asked my question, she responded by describing to me the boundaries of the Tewa Pueblo world, which encompass from the Colorado border, 150 miles south to Albuquerque, and all of Los Alamos and Santa Fe. And I had a similar experience with a Hispanic settler who traces his lineage back to the conquistadors and grew up both in a traditional Hispanic village and in Los Alamos. And he also was really reluctant to pick one thing. And when I realized that, that sent me all the way back to the beginning. So now I wanted to think about what is love and what is justice, and what are the two in relation? Like, what do these words actually mean? And so, as I often do, I went back to etymologies. Oh, here's a picture of Los Alamos you can see on the mesas. It's both the town and the lab. So, justice comes from a Latin root. It came into English in written form around the 14th century, and it means a right, equitable, fair, impartial. So then I looked up what is a right, and that's older in English. It's from Old English, and it means a duty or an obligation, what someone deserves, equitable treatment. And so interpreting this, I felt like justice refers not only to rights that we as individuals hold, but to the obligation we have to one another to recognize each other's rights. And a right is to exist, right? To be able to breathe and eat and have a dwelling and exercise one's will, right? Have freedom. So I went there with justice, and then love is boring in comparison. Love is a really old word. It's in Old English and English, but it comes from like constructed, because they don't have this in writing, a Proto-Indo-European root, which just means it predates all of the European and Indian languages, and it just means love. And there are cognates in every language, or to care or desire. So I was helped in my definition of love by Bell Hooks again, who wrote a book in the 90s called All About Love, where she really kind of takes this like systematic look at what love is or might be. And Bell Hooks quotes Erich Fromm, who was a German Jewish sociologist and philosopher who thought a lot about love in the wake of the Holocaust. And she quotes him as saying, "Love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth." So I thought that was really interesting. Like, love is about, in this definition, spiritual existence, whereas justice seems to be about physical existence. But both of them imply this commitment to both oneself and others. So I went back to the quotes that inspired me, and I put the definitions in instead of the words. So it ends up being, instead of at the heart of all justice must be radical love, to at the heart of all work towards supporting each being's ability to exist must be a radical commitment to that being's spiritual expansion. And then bell hooks, without a commitment to another's ability to physically exist, there can be no commitment to another's spiritual expansion. And by these definitions, Oppenheimer didn't really love New Mexico. He wasn't committed to the physical and spiritual existence of all the beings there. He wanted to be there himself. And I think by this definition, the original settlers didn't have that love either. They wanted a place, they wanted land, a place for themselves to subsist. They didn't have any respect. In fact, they had violence against the people who were already there. I think what they had was more like a craving or a desire, which has connotations of possession and ownership. And so I started to think about, is there a way to get beyond craving and beyond desire and beyond possession to actual love? And when I started doing that, I went back to both Baldwin and Hooks, and I started pulling out the qualities of love that they enumerate based on their own thinking and their sources. And so I just want to show those to you. The first one, love requires clarity and truth-telling. I think that Baldwin really helped me think about this. He writes that white people in America have been brainwashed to believe that they're superior. Again, he's writing in the early 60s, and he says that inside, a lot of people actually feel inferior and like they're not measuring up, and that creates this kind of unbearable dissonance for people. And the truth is that they're humans, like any other human, both flawed and miraculous. And that's why the final quote, he talks about the importance of seeing selves as we really are so that we can change things. The second quality is listening, and to me this is also like seeing, right? It's being able to really hear others' truths, but also our own, to be able to really listen to what our own minds and hearts are telling us. And then self-love. Again, I think that Baldwin is so brilliant here, talking about the fact that our own lack of comfort with ourselves or dislike for ourselves can get turned outward. And then love is active, participatory, and communal. So Bell Hooks writes about love, action being the shape love takes in the world. And in acting, you interact necessarily with people, objects, everything in the world, and that in turn reshapes your inner self. And she uses this wonderful quote from Thomas Merton, which I love. Life curves upward to a peak of intensity, a high point of value and meaning, at which all its latent creative possibility go into action, and the person, I don't know about transcends, but meets another in response and communion. I love the creative possibilities there. Bell Hooks also says something really interesting, which is, to take love from this common conception in our culture of this, individual, almost sort of private experience of desire among two people. And she spends a lot of time sort of debunking that myth, that that's even a thing, in order to think about love as this sort of social force for creativity and communal change. And interdependence. And she quotes, again, I think this is such a beautiful quote of Martin Luther King Jr. We're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. He was such a poet. I think that is related to the writing that I was doing in the plastic book, and what the critic Lynn Keller called the polymeric thinking is trying to just, be with that truth of being so deeply interconnected to look at and understand that. So I'm gonna just leave that. Oh, I forgot two important aspects, sorry. Courage and risk. Again, I just love this Baldwin quote, not the infantile American sense of being made happy. Of the idea that love is risk, because if you're being changed internally and if you're committed to something, then you will have some risk. You will be vulnerable in some way. And then that comes very close on the heels of change, right? You'll be changed. Hooks says, love is action in the world, and then we interact, and then we are changed. And she also talks about how people are afraid of change, and so they resist it, but in fact that we are always subject to radical change. And she talks about technology and how radically technology has changed our lives and how we adapt to that. And often that change is imposed on us from above, from more powerful forces. But what if we embraced change and became the agents of our own change? So now I will stop. Those are the qualities I was able to glean about love. And I just be grateful to hear any reactions to that from any of you. Anything missing here? Anything that seems off to you? Any blind spot I've had here? Yes, in the back.
I'd like to hear more about this idea that you found at the beginning that made you go back to etymology, about this question of discreteness, like this discrete, asking for something that they love in nature. And yeah, I just want to hear more about this, like what those conversations were like. I don't know if this is the appropriate time to ask that though, or if I should ask it at the end, but. Yeah,
thanks for asking that. I had wonderful conversations with both of those people in which I had the sense of such a stitching of self into a whole sense of a living landscape. And I actually also had a similar conversation in some ways with a nuclear colonist that I want to read a little bit to you from. So I honestly think like a lot of the book is going to be just bearing witness to that. So stay tuned. Thank you for asking that. Yes.
I thought it was interesting when you mentioned that change is necessary, the risk of change is a part of love and what goes into it, and having to have courage really tied into what you were saying earlier about love feeling similar to fear. Similar to fear in the body, and how vulnerable you have to be with both of those emotions and how they are tied together. Yeah, that was really it.
Yeah, so if you didn't hear the whole comment, I'll see if I can get it right. It was about how love and fear are so tied, and the comment earlier about love being connected to fear in the body, the idea that love requires courage and risk and the vulnerability of that. I think that's right. I think there's a real good reason why this kind of conception of love is not very widely practiced, understood, accepted in a culture where we are based in fear. Our politics are very based in fear, right? So yeah, I think that's a really good insight. Yes, in the back.
What color do you think love is?
What color do I think love is? What color do you think love is? I think it changes all the time. I have the culturally accepted, like I got a fast red, but then I got greens and blues. One of what spurs me to write this book is that I love the place where I was born. When I was a kid, I would go into the Ponderosa forests. I felt like the trees talked to me. They had a name for me, a secret name, which my sister read about in my journal and made fun of me. So now I can never say the name, but I know what it is. And I had this profound experience in these forests, which incidentally have burned and may not come back because of climate change. So right away twinned with grief, and also growing up and coming to understand the violent legacy of why I was there. So for me, it's complicated. It's a complicated thing. Another thing Bell Hooks said that I didn't quote, but which I think about a lot, and I think is in this book, is, we listen to what others have to say, even if there's grief and sadness in it, and even if the sadness is endless. Like, I love that because, do I love it? I recognize it, because when you're dealing with things that have a 24 million year half-life, right? It's pretty endless. Any other burning thoughts? Thank you so much for those insights. As I said, I'm finding my way, and so I'm really grateful to you. And any ideas that you have that you want to share, I would love to hear them. I thought I would read you just a little bit from one of my interviews. I interviewed a nuclear colonist, and like I said, I interviewed others, but I haven't had time to write those interviews up yet, so I'm going to read you this one. I asked this person what was their favorite aspect of the place. They told me juniper trees, Juniperus scopularum, but they also told me they were being a good student and following directions, but they actually told me afterward that they wanted to talk about several other things as well. And I realized that what Charlie was really talking about in this conversation is light. And so that's the title of it right now. It's crossed out. And maybe when I'm reading this, I'll put the qualities of love back up, and you could just take a look and see if you see any of those qualities showing up. I'm probably going to read excerpts from this because it's a little bit longer. Are you doing okay? Is everybody good? Should we breathe? Let's breathe. It's a little like dark and cozy in here, right? You can take a nap. It's okay. I won't mind. I love the cozy because it's cozy season. That's what we call it instead of rainy season, cozy. So let's just breathe a little bit. You can move if you want. Try not to whack your neighbor. And feel free to move as I'm reading too. You can get up if you want, do whatever you need to do. Okay, this is Charlie. Have you ever looked inside a juniper tree, Charlie asks me. You haven't. Well, you need to do that. Charlie tells me he came to Los Alamos as a toddler in the late 1940s. His father, a mechanical engineer, oversaw the construction of several buildings at the nuclear lab. My father was responsible for some of the ugliest buildings in town, says Charlie. Charlie's father made real in concrete and steel the transformation of Los Alamos from a temporary wartime project to an enduring nuclear weapons laboratory. Charlie expects me to be familiar with the concrete monstrosities built by his father, the core technical facilities of Los Alamos. But our lenses on Los Alamos differ. During my childhood, I spent almost no time on lab property. Charlie worked there for 33 years. This makes Charlie and his wife's Connie's families a bit of a rarity among nuclear settlers I knew. 3 generations lived in town or nearby. Because the only industry involves scientific research, most people move to Los Alamos to work at the lab and then leave. Charlie left too for a while. When he was a sophomore in high school, his family moved to liberal Kansas. I always loved Los Alamos, he says. I loved it being right in the mountains, and because of the dry air, it's almost perfect light. Liberal Kansas does not have perfect light. Charlie nearly always speaks with an edge of irony to his voice, as if you shouldn't take what he's saying too seriously because it might be a joke, or as if he has an understanding that on some level, everything is a joke. Charlie cares about light because, in addition to being trained as a chemist and a computer scientist, he is a poet and photographer. He records instants of light. I came back to Los Alamos as soon as I got a chance, he says, first as a college student working in the CMR building his father had built, and then, after earning degrees from UC Berkeley, as a lab employee. I knew Charlie did something with computers, but as a child, I never paid much attention to him. He was just the father of my best friend Janine, one of the adult presences giving shape and structure to my life. My memories of Charlie involve the outdoors. On weekends, he took us on hikes through Bandelier National Monument or fishing in the Jemez Mountains. We trailed behind him inside our own worlds. We spent hours skipping rocks over the flat surface of a pond, peeling ponderosa needles into curlicues, or carving soft tuff. Charlie also hunted, but he did not bring us on these trips or teach us what he knew. Probably we took no interest. I remember our teenage horror at blood running down the driveway from a deer he had bagged and hung in the garage. Charlie hunted with a gun and with bow and arrow. I imagine him doing this, cultivating stillness, attention to the rhythms and movements around him, the same focus he now directs through his camera and into the words of his poems. The word attention comes from two roots, ad for to or toward, and tendere, to stretch, a stretching toward. Maybe Charlie learned this desire, the reach toward the beings of this world, from his father. In his poem, Dad's Dream, Charlie records his dying father reliving the joy of fly fishing in mountain waters, casting time after time until a flash of color yanked his line upstream. In 1998, Charlie stood beside a different kind of river. A Washington Post reporter described following Charlie inside a secure room at the lab to see Blue Mountain, then the world's fastest computer. Charlie directed the reporter's attention to water flowing in an elegant stream over a blue and gold cooling box. There is no blueprint for what we're trying to do now, Charlie told the reporter. The task, to create a three-dimensional simulation of a nuclear explosion with an unprecedented level of realism, and, as the reporter explained, virtually speaking, place the scientists inside a bomb. After 1992, computers became the weapons designer's most critical tool. That year, Congress agreed to a moratorium on nuclear testing. The decision followed a Russian test moratorium, both driven in part by citizen protest in each country. US leaders had already agreed in 1963 to stop exploding nuclear weapons in the air and underwater. Now they would no longer set them off underground either. Los Alamos scientists conducted the nation's last nuclear blast on September 23, 1992. The lab reached its goal, the world's first three-dimensional simulation of a thermonuclear explosion, in 2001 by networking the Blue Mountain system at Los Alamos with a supercomputer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Berkeley. The anthropologist Joseph Masco writes about this development in his study of post-Cold War New Mexico called Nuclear Borderlands. He notes the simulation took 122 days and involved 35 times the amount of information in the Library of Congress. The results came to life on the power wall at Los Alamos, which Masco describes as the largest and most detailed projection screen on the planet. The 16 by 8 foot wall delivered what the Post article had promised, bringing humans inside a nuclear explosion with the ability to manipulate the simulation using virtual reality gloves. I find it hard to imagine such fantastic creations, a computer cooled by a flowing river, an immersive theater blooming with exploding atoms inside the concrete walls of Los Alamos. My childhood took place a few mesas away in a different era and another reality, attuned to the US commercialism of the 1970s and 80s. I collected Smurfs and watched Tom and Jerry, later MTV on cable. I lived in ignorance of what happened across Omega Bridge at the laboratory. I do not talk to Charlie about any of this. Instead, I ask him to tell me about his favorite plant or tree in New Mexico. Rocky Mountain juniper, he says, it adapts. How tall it grows depends on how much water it gets. So if it doesn't get much water, it's short and squatty. And if it gets a lot of water, it becomes tall and a little bit squatty. He laughs. But it manages to prosper in this dry and sometimes hostile climate. It's a survivor. As a child, I paid little attention to juniper. Like Charlie, its presence gave shape to my life, disappearing in its ubiquity on the mesas around Los Alamos and in its many guises, tree, bush, a low-growing hybrid in people's yards. My knowledge of this tree is physical. I know its forms, growing out of thin soil on top of volcanic tuff or seemingly straight out of rock at the edge of a cliff. Half skeleton, trunk gnarled and twisted, live branches sprouting alongside dead ones. I know its flat, waxy needles with tiny scales, its bluish berries hazed with a powdery coating that I could wipe away with my fingers so the fruit glowed. I know the resinous smell from pinching the hard berry with my nail, the feeling of climbing beneath low branches for hide and seek, tense with listening, inhaling tree breath, piney and bitter. Facts I did not know about juniper. Like many beings that endure, it grows exceedingly slowly. After 8 years, it reaches 1 foot. It grows 3 to 4 inches a year after that until age 40, when its growth slows to 1 inch or less annually. It reaches peak seed production between 50 and 200 years. It twists as it grows, a slow motion reaction to wind and other stressors. The twisted trunk and branches, the sun collecting and reproducing bits, represent the smallest part of the juniper. It can send a taproot straight down for 20 feet or more, pushing even through rock, and shallow lateral roots stretch 100 feet, anchoring the tree and pulling sparse moisture toward itself. Most of this being exists below earth. The deep reach of juniper lets it survive harsh conditions. Its species name, Scopulorum, means rocky place. Its waxy seals close to prevent water loss, and when resources are scarce, it can cut off nutrients to parts of itself. This is what gives old junipers their skeletal look. The oldest known living member of its species, the Hardin juniper in Logan Canyon, Utah, has stood for 1,500 years. It is a massive gray furrowed bark and corkscrew branches rising like a dinosaur out of the earth, one poof of solar collecting green at its very top. The poet Daniela Molnar describes the juniper growing in the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico, parched and seeking a water ghost, a slow writhing thing. But Rocky Mountain juniper is hard to pin down. It grows in a surprising array of climates, from Western Canada south to Arizona, New Mexico, and West Texas, at elevations from sea level to 9,000 feet. It tolerates temperatures from 35 below zero to 110 degrees. It shows up as sculpted pyramid in concrete parking lots and as windbreaks in the plain states. Molnar writes, "The shroud of my mouth tries to contain the juniper. That ancient, edgeless being will not still inside its name." I interviewed Charlie at his home in Santa Fe by video from my home in Oregon. I saved only the sound recording. For some reason, it captured his voice, but not my own. Long silences punctuate his speech. I had felt a bit nervous and talked more than I knew. The absence of sound where I spoke is digital and therefore total. No ambient noise, no shushing or whirring, just blanks in the place of my voice. After one long stretch of quiet, Charlie responds to me. Yes. Silence. Yes. Yes. New Mexico is fundamental to who I think of myself as being. This phrase stayed with me. He did not say, "New Mexico is my home," or "I belong here." His words reached deeper into his very identity, an identity that is, at least in part, a conscious creation, process through intellect, by thinking. Charlie's most recent poetry book offers another manifestation of self. He leaves out that he spent a career advancing the ability to simulate complex phenomena on some of the world's fastest computers. He writes that he lives in northern New Mexico, content to take pictures, write poems, and live a quiet life. After Janine and I grew up and moved away from home, our parents bought land and built cabins near one another at the western edge of a high mountain valley close to the Colorado border. The land title dated from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War and promised to honor land grants to settlers issued by Spain and later Mexico. Our parents' land sat within the Tierra Amarilla grant that Mexico issued to local settlers in 1832. It encompassed nearly 600,000 acres. The 1832 grant ignored the fact that indigenous Ute and Jicarilla Apache people claimed and controlled the area for hunting and subsistence. Members of the Caputa Band of Ute spent the next 50 years fighting colonial incursions. Unrelenting pressure and violence from local militias and the U.S. military finally pushed the Utes north into reservations. Meanwhile, white speculators began buying up pieces of the Tierra Amarilla grant, relying on corrupt officials and lawyers to manipulate the process for determining land claims. A similar process played out across the U.S. Southwest. Over a few decades, Mexican land grant holders lost most of their land, tens of millions of acres, to mines, ranches, and timber companies. By 1900, 2 white men owned the entire Tierra Amarilla grant, making them among the largest landowners in the U.S. Land grant holders resisted, but the men who took the land controlled the system. Their heirs have fought ever since to regain their titles. For years, a billboard stood beside the highway on the way to the cabin, emblazoned in bold black letters, Tierra o Muerte, land or death, with Zapata Vive scrawled in red letters beside a portrait of Emiliano Zapata, the Mexican revolutionary. Zapata's rallying cry, Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, galvanized the Mexican Revolution and led peasants to resist wealthy landowners enclosing the commons. In Tierra Amarilla, it represented a recent fight among local residents against an Arizona developer, which led to a nearly year-long armed occupation. Land or death. For my mother, the sentiment meant something else. She used to declare, with her dramatic flair, that weekends at the cabin saved my father from having a heart attack during his stressful years at the nuclear laboratory. Over 30 years, our families fished in nearby Heron Lake, named not for the bird, but for a white settler on the Tierra Amarilla grant in the early 20th century who proposed diverting water through the mountains to drier cities further south. After years of drought left water levels in the lake too low, our parents gave up fishing. They still enjoyed looking out for osprey and bald eagles, exchanging news of bear and mountain lion sightings with the neighbors, and watching sunsets burnish with gold the sheer granite of the Brazos cliffs across the valley. Soon after my mother died, my father sold the cabin and the land. I think grief drove him away from it. When Charlie asked if I'd ever seen the inside of a juniper, I thought he meant looking inside the tree into the branches. That was not his meaning. If you cut a juniper log in half, it looks like cedar, he said. It has beautiful red and white patterns in the wood. Charlie agreed to speak with me out of love because of his fatherly affection, his care for whatever I do in my life. He trusted me with his words without knowing exactly what might become of them. This faith, the leap love makes, why, when it risks such wounding? I feel this answer. Nothing exists outside relation without that tendere the reach across the gap. Each cell gives off a tiny bit of light, and a being's glow is rhythmic, brightening and dimming. It is that light in every form that calls for tending. Near the end of our conversation, Charlie says, "Up at the cabin, we have a lot of juniper. One thing I always loved, and we saw this often coming back from evenings with your mom and dad, all these juniper trees lit up in the rain. They have tiny needles, so they hold a huge amount of raindrops, and in the car headlights, they're like torches. They glow." That's the end. Thank you so much for your attention and your kindness. I left out some tragic parts about nuclear weapons testing around the world. And the fact that since Blue Mountain, Los Alamos has named all of its supercomputers after testing series from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So like the next computer was called Crossroads, which were the first nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, which left Bikini Island so contaminated the Bikinians have never returned. And then they went back in history and called the next one Trinity, which was the first atomic explosion. It's amazing to me, the language that gets used there and the kind of like amnesia, the inability to like really look at reality and see it. The tagline for Los Alamos, the town has a tagline, which I wish I had a picture of because it's on a rock when you come into town. It says, "Los Alamos, where discoveries are made!" ! So, yeah, there's a lot. The poems write themselves. I would love to just open it now to questions from people on the Zoom or people in the room or comments or ideas. Like, did you see any of these qualities there? Did you see the overcoming of that discreteness that you had mentioned in the back? That sort of narrowing of view into a single being? Yeah, I would just love to hear anything you have to say.
This is from the Q&A. Mm-hmm. This is from Arian. Can you hear me? At the end of Crave, the imagery of the plastic bag alongside the description of the intimate handling of your mother's ashes creates a striking tension. There's an uncanny intimacy that borders on the erotic while evoking broader themes of social and environmental history alongside your own personal grief. Could you speak to how you navigated these intersecting layers of intimacy and history in your writing, particularly in such a deeply personal context?
Could you all hear that? Yeah, that was a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I always take on very big topics for whatever reason. I've never been able to not write about nuclear weapons. That's probably obvious, the reason for that. And I think what I found is the through life in all of my writing is my embodied being. I wrote a book called Greenwood about a 19th century cemetery in Brooklyn that was really about me walking around in that cemetery after September 11th, which I experienced in New York, trying to figure out what to do next. I think with the description of interacting with that plastic bag and ashes and my mother, it was just about that embodied experience and all of those interconnections. But the thing about growing up in a colonial place, which I think many of us do, but in Los Alamos, those colonial relations, it's still very colonial there, and they're very visible all the time. And so every little intimate breath or act or exchange is freighted with this deep colonial history. And really looking at it with love, like really looking at it and being able to see it with clarity requires that like unfolding, all the unfolding. So I don't think that answered that question, but maybe it was just a reflection related to it. Yeah.
So I kind of have two questions, if that's okay.
Of course.
The first one is, would you consider your work to be poetry or prose?
That's such a good question. Do you want me to answer that and then you can ask the other one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they're not related.
Yes, I would consider my work to be poetry and prose. I think that genres are a way of placing books onto shelves and in bookstores and knowing, for publishers, knowing what they are. I think that I write a lot from instincts, and I think the gift of, I have an MFA in poetry, and the gift of being trained as a poet is that, and identifying as a poet is that I'm not trying to be a historian. I'm not trying to be a science writer. I'm trying to be a human and navigate my way through all of these bodies of knowledge to arrive at some understanding. And I do that in writing. So identifying as poet and non-expert lets me go a bunch of different places and also lets me do whatever I want, right? Like I can throw some lines of poetry in there, or I can put a whole poem in. I get a lot of, as they say, license. I have a lot of poetic license. So I guess both.
Okay. And then my second question is, your work is obviously like heavily based in Los Alamos and like growing up there, but you're based in Portland now. So I was kind of wondering if living in Portland kind of affects how you think about Los Alamos, or like how you write about it. Like, do you go back and visit, or do you mostly focus on like your memories of it?
Thanks for asking that. Yes, I left there when I was graduated from high school and didn't come back to live there for an extended period again, but I still go often. I still have a lot of ties there. I think that it took me my entire life to this age to be able to write very directly about my nuclear colonial history, which was not only my own evolution, but there's nuclear colonialism is a phrase that is a little bit new in the literature, and so lots of people are starting to look at this. So I've been influenced by many, many other thinkers. I think actually, so I have lots of memory, but I also have, I go there multiple times a year. My family is still there. Most of my family is still there. I think one thing that was a big change that actually happened just at the beginning of this year is that my father left Los Alamos and now lives in Santa Fe, which is about 30 miles away, which I didn't think would have meaning, but actually like not having any of my family members physically present in that town feels kind of like a freedom. My friend I reference in the book, Janine, she and I grew up together, Charlie's daughter, we would have this experience of driving to the top of the mesa where Los Alamos hits and getting to the top and just feeling this like this kind of weight come down on us. It is an intense place. And so I feel like just not having to go there unless I choose, Like go there thoughtlessly because I'd visit my father, but not having to go there is actually freeing. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just got back from New Mexico, by the way. I went to the Trinity site where the first atomic bomb was exploded. They open it, it's on a missile range, the White Sands Missile Range, and they open it once a year to the public. So I just came back from there. Yeah.
This is kind of to your earlier question on this slide where you were like, anyway, sorry, I wrote it down. So okay. I was going to suggest understanding as a contender to listening, but then I thought of the people and beings that I love and how I don't understand them, and that's not integral to that. And so then I was thinking, well, would like the phrase taking in work? As you love, you take in the other, a more active and risk-bearing form of listening with your full self.
Yes, that is beautiful. So let me see if I can paraphrase what you said. As you are listening, just say it again. Can you say that?
Yeah, so as you take in the other, a more active and risk-bearing form of listening with your full self.
As you take in the other, a more active, and I missed that word.
Risk-bearing.
Risk-bearing, a more active and risk-bearing form of listening with your whole self. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. I think you're right. Understanding is maybe not the key to it. There are, and I did bear witness to this in the plastic book too, as a colonist coming in and wanting to talk to people, there's a long history of white scholars, anthropologists, archaeologists coming into northern New Mexico to study people, a very extractive history. And they had a desire and a curiosity that brought them there, right? And I feel like the action of wanting to ask people questions can be participating in that colonial desire, right? To divulge to me. And so I also honor the people who don't want to talk to me, to their silence and the limits of my own understanding. There are also things like the Pueblo world is very famous for its secrecy. One of the ways that those cultures have survived 500 years of colonialism is by kind of going underground, like keeping a lot of their religious and ceremonial beliefs secret. So there are things I will never know, that will never be shared with me. And I hope that doesn't preclude love. I think it's important to bear witness to it. There's a wonderful Tewa Pueblo historian called Dimitri Brown who talked about that Oppenheimer movie that came out a couple summers ago, and the fact that, indigenous people, the Pueblo people, are basically completely erased, and so are the Hispanic settlers, basically completely erased from that movie. There are a few artifacts that show up, and he talks about that silence can be in some ways seen as intentional. As a protection of the cultures. But he also said something interesting, which was in order for it to have impact, maybe the silence needs to be rendered or visible in some way. And so I'm thinking about, for people who don't want to talk to me, maybe there's blanks in the book for that. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's coming. Mo's got it.
There was a line that stood out to me in your reading, and that was "light calls for tending." And I was wondering if you could expand on that, and specifically if or how you equate love to light.
Yeah, the light calls for tending was the line that you quoted. So that's what is it? Oh, each cell gives off a tiny bit of light is a quote from a poem by a poet called Banu Kapil. And I loved that line. A lot of times I'm flipping through poetry books for inspiration. I loved that line, and sometimes they just hit me. And I looked up, I was like, is that true? And it is true. It is true. Cells give off light. We can't see them. We can't see the light, but cells do give off, because of whatever, I don't know, their metabolism, a little bit of light. And they do have these diurnal cycles, brightening and dimming. So I love that. And I thought, well, that's such a, the light to me kind of encapsulates both the physical and the spiritual sort of existence. To me, it kind of represents that, and so it's that's the justice, and that's the love in the other that we can reach toward. Was just in that moment for me a metaphor for that. I don't know. What do you think? Do you have thoughts?
That I was just wondering your thought process, so that definitely answers the question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Here it comes.
I'm curious about your thought process regarding, you just said, leaving blank spots in the page, and how places are sort of left blank. There's this artist, Trevor Paglen, who is a cartographer and an artist, and he had one called Blank Spots in the Map, which is about testing facilities and black sites, So I'm just curious about if you sort of like interface with like, I just thought it was interesting that you thought you were going to leave like blank spots in the book versus blank spots that are left purposefully blank, that are made blank.
Yeah, thanks for that question. What kind of testing sites does the
Nuclear weapons testing sites.
This artist does?
Yes.
Oh, can you say their name again?
Trevor Paglen.
P-A?
P-A-G-L-E-N.
Okay, I need to know this. Thank you.
Yeah, he also, you also mentioned in the beginning that it's the Los Alamos has expanded recently, and a bunch of other like of these secret sites have also expanded. Like Adrian Myers recently is like an MIT student or something, and he recently used satellite imagery to track the expansion of Gitmo.
Track the expansion of Guantanamo Bay. Wow. Okay. Yes, there is a quiet, massive expansion happening in the nuclear weapons complex in the United States. So this is amazing. Thank you for sharing those things with me. Yeah, I think the silences do correspond in a lot of ways to, like, it's interesting because what the historian Dimitri Brown brought up was this, like, silence as an act of agency among the indigenous people, right? It's not just like they were silenced or they are being silenced, they have been silenced, but they're choosing silence. And so I'm interested in that tension too, but also these communities do show up as blank spots on the map, right? There's another scholar of nuclear colonialism who grew up in a Hispanic community very close to Los Alamos. Her name's Miria Gomez, and she writes about how the like line about why Los Alamos is where it is because it was remote and there was nothing around, which is an erasure. It's a blanking of the map of all of those indigenous and Hispanic communities that were all right there, including on top of the mesa. And then also in the Marshall Islands, there's a reason that the US didn't test its thermonuclear weapons in, whatever, Manhattan or Oregon or Washington. They picked a place where there was no one, and Henry Kissinger is famous as saying, like, there's, however many people in the Marshall Islands, who gives a damn? So those people were blanked off the map conceptually, but also like literally blown off the map, right? There are islands that just vaporized and disappeared. So I love this point. There's a real tension and also a real interaction among the blanks on the map and silences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your answer.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I always learn a lot from Evergreen when I come here. You all are wonderful. Thanks so much for all your generosity.
Hello. Okay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your lecture and inviting us to like have a conversation too. I want to zoom like way out and just ask like a really practical question about like how do you like conduct your research and organize it, especially like as a writer myself, when I like hear or read kind of like a finished or near finished product, it just like dazzles me of like all these details woven together. So I'm just asking like practically, like how did you get there?
Chaos, despair, self-doubt, anxiety. Does that help? It's true. I mean, again, like being trained as a poet, I do my research pretty dang intuitively. I pick up threads that I'm interested in and follow them, but I also have a commitment to rigor. Like I want to treat with respect the subject matter and, and all of the knowledge that's been laid down before me. I want to faithfully follow those trails. And so I have a lot of tabs open on my computer. I keep a sources list where I just like cut and paste, computers make it so much easier, cut and paste sources. Being at an institution, I don't have an institutional affiliation, so I try to wrangle them. Like I'm a visiting scholar at Reed this semester, so I can use their library. In terms of actually physically dealing with the materials, I use different techniques along with self-doubt, anxiety, and despair. I will like spread everything out on the floor and look at it. I need to look at things visually. I know people use software, like Scrivener is a thing. I haven't tried that. I have, this is ironic, when I wrote the plastic book, I used styrofoam insulation boards and put them all around my room and pinned up the book. I did something similar with the book Greenwood I wrote and like visually traced the threads, the themes of the book with thread. So I've tried a bunch of different things. It looks different every book, but I feel you.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So up here's a definition of love, and I'm just curious, back to one of the first quotes, that at the heart of all work toward justice must be a radical love. So I'm wondering how radical love may differ than what's on the slide.
That's really good that you clued into that word radical. I would love to know if you have thoughts. Not to put you on the spot. If you don't, that's fine.
Maybe something more time-related. I guess maybe this change gets to that, and activity. I'm thinking of treaties in the Americas, and how settlers and colonial governments thought of them as kind of like discrete in time, and that like, oh, it's signed and done with. Whereas it's viewed more from other parties, First Nations, as an ongoing relation. Mm-hmm. So something about time, maybe.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this? Where radical comes in here in this definition of love?
Perhaps in the use of radical itself, like radical meaning like from the roots, and relating to time, like the rootedness of a place, like love that has to take consideration of the generational hauntings, both the joys and the traumas. Radical love is like listening to the like body politic, not just the specific like bodies.
We're recording this, right? That was amazing. Thank you. Yeah, one over here. Related to the full body politic, not just some bodies, and radical related to the root. I love that. Going back to the root, yeah, dismantling, maybe myths. You know, Bell Hooks writes a lot about what our cultural myths around love and how they can be damaging. Like love is a thing that happens to us, like we fall. We just like fall. I mean, I've fallen in love. It is a thing, but it's not the only thing. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
A little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think that for something to be radical, it needs to be like bigger than yourself. If I'm going to tie it to the roots, it has to be rooted in like everything, not just like one person or one desire. It has to be like for all.
Yeah. Could you all hear that? Radical, something bigger than yourself, rooted, going back to the roots. Tell me if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly. Like rooted, connected to all. It's the communal nature of it. It's so vast. Yeah, I love that. And maybe it's radical because it's a break. It's something different from, I don't know what Keta means by radical love. I'm going to ask her. She runs something called the Center for Diversity in the Environment. She's a wonderful social justice, racial justice advocate. I'm going to ask her. what she means. She says diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and liberation. But maybe it's radical as going against this grain of the kind of received definitions of love we have. I feel like, are there other thoughts about radical or anything else? I feel like we could talk for hours, yeah. It's also a little weird that I'm down here with a microphone, like looking up at all of you, but I am loving this conversation. Thank you.
This isn't as much a comment on radical love or anything, because I agree with what they were saying, this idea that it has to be bigger than yourself. But I just wanted to say I just appreciated your sort of multifaceted discussion and sort of seems like an ongoing exploration of what love means to you personally. I don't know, it's just like, I feel like people tend to hone in on one or more aspects of some kind of relationship that doesn't get talked about as much. I don't know, I really appreciate the sensitivity of your work, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. I appreciate that. I didn't say that in the mic. Thank you. It's very meaningful to me. Shaw has one. Oh no, down here, okay.
First of all, thank you again for being here. This is more of kind of a comment because I grew up in Alaska in like a newly colonized place, I guess, very noticeable. And as like a white settler myself, something I see a lot there is like a love of nature, but nature as like a resource. And I was just kind of wondering if you see that in New Mexico as well with nature as well. If it's more than just the is the resources for the nuclear lab, is it mined there as well? And if you wanted to expand on that, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. The resources for weapons are not mined in Los Alamos, but they are in New Mexico. So they call New Mexico a cradle-to-grave nuclear state because uranium is mined there. Weapons are designed there and then disposed of. There's the only active nuclear waste repository in the country there. Right, I forgot your question for a minute. Land as a resource. You know, it's interesting in Los Alamos, they're not a land-based people, as they say there, right? They're a bunch of like mostly physicists and chemists. There are others, but that's the predominant, scientists. And there's not so much seeing the land as a resource, but like an entitlement to it. Like there's this recreation thing, right? And like there's a wealth there because the government pays nuclear scientists well. We do, we taxpayers. And there's this like, they can get gear, and there's this kind of like sense of entitlement to the place. Actually, Charlie, in a conversation I had with him sort of recently when I was there, one of the pueblos, its ancient ancestral site, they manage rather than it being like a national park or something the colonists run, and that's sort of like open when they feel like it. And so in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, you could go there whenever you want, but of course like people would come in and kind of trash it, and now they block it off, and if they feel like letting people in, they will. And Charlie was like, we used to be able to go there, he was sort of like meh, meh, meh. Like a sense of entitlement I think is very pervasive there. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, so much. That was awesome. Thank you. I love that.